83 years after the Salem witch trials divided Salem Village, the descendants of those same families answered a bell, stood together on a village training field, and ran 16 miles together toward the sound of British gunfire. Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we are talking with Dan Gagnon, Danvers teacher, historian, and author of A Salem Witch, a biography of Rebecca Nurse. Dan is back with us today to connect the Salem witch trials to the American Revolution. Welcome back, Dan Gagnon, to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. Tell us a little bit about your work and what brought you to Salem history.
Hello all. Well, my name is Dan Gagnon. I live in Danvers, Massachusetts. They used to be known as Salem Village during the time of the witch hunt. My book was A Salem Witch, a biography of Rebecca Nurse, one of the victims of the 1692 witch hunt. And recently, in the past year or two, I've been invited to give some talks on some events of the 250th anniversaries of events during the American Revolution locally here on the North Shore. And so today, those two interests kind of intersect.
It's so great to have you here today with America 250 going on. We're really excited to talk about ties between witch trial families and the American Revolution. And I'm so excited to hear from a Danvers historian personally, as somebody whose grandfather came from Danvers and have a lot of my family history from that town. It's so exciting to learn more about the role of Essex County in Massachusetts in the Revolution and some of those key figures. So why is it significant that the area known for one of America's darker chapters contributed to the creation of an independent nation?
Well, I think one thing about these two sort of historical topics, the creating the independent nation of the United States and the witch trials, is that they seem very far removed from one another. With the way people learn history in many high schools in America, they really start with the American Revolution, and therefore the witch trials seem so distant behind it because it's like not even covered, so it must have been a long time ago. In reality, it's only about a generation later in some cases. In others, we have participants in the witch trials, you have grandchildren. It'd be like 2 generations later. But some of these are just their sons, their daughters, still alive at the time of the revolution and play important roles. With the witch hunt, we see a real movement as it ends at the end of 1692 to try to give people accused of crimes, prisoners, more rights. We have the witch hunt ends because of public pressure. It's not, really democracy, but it's public pressure. The Puritans all throughout the 1600s were really concerned about their rights. They really valued their self-government. And so it really isn't much of a surprise that it was Massachusetts that were really some of the most vocal advocates for these rights when the king in the 1760s and 1770s starts to infringe on them.
So in that 83 years, their personality as a colony just continues to develop.
It definitely does. We saw in the 1680s prior to the witch hunt, when Massachusetts had its first charter taken away and there was more direct rule by London, we saw protests across the North Shore here, Essex County. People were complaining that they're being taxed without representation. Wow, I wonder where that comes from, that slogan. If they're saying that in the 1680s, you can bet they're saying it wicked loud when it comes time to the 1770s, that really is a long-standing set of beliefs there. And with the 83 years that pass, Massachusetts in the 1680s is not exactly the same as the 1770s. Of course not. We have new groups of people moving in. Not everybody is a Puritan. Really, of course, we would be discussing the Congregational Church at that point, more known by that name. But there is still that foundation that the people of Massachusetts, for the most part, trace themselves back to those Puritan settlers or the Pilgrims on the South Shore of Massachusetts. And that is sort of their founding fathers are that Puritan migration still.
I was thinking about the 83 years thing, and looking back 83 years from today puts us in the middle of World War II. And certainly I've known plenty of World War II veterans in my lifetime, even met World War I veterans. early on. And so it doesn't seem to me that 1775 to 1692 is that huge a time period. What's the significance that people whose families were directly involved in the witch trials were now kind of moving forward with this bold step to create this country?
Well, one thing I think that it shows really importantly is that the community has returned to some sense of normalcy in Salem Village that becomes Danvers, in the town of Salem, now the city of Salem, and that they really had to get along because your ancestor might have been on one side of the witch hunt, the other person's might have been on the other side, but like you're living on farms next door to each other. It has to be made to work. And what we see is locally, we have muster rolls of people who are in the Danvers militia and also the Minutemen as we get closer to the actual outbreak of the revolution, people who are elected as selectmen, people who are important at various town meetings. And we see all of these last names that are connected to people from 1692 working together and moving forward. Really a area that was very much on the Patriot side leading up to the revolution. You have them joining forces, for example, to basically blackball merchants who are still importing from Britain. We have them drilling and really in the creation of the militia, or the reorganization, I should say, because it had existed before, of the militia. You have these groups that elect their own officers. You have these people elected from the community that really is kind of a direct democracy. It's your officer wasn't the officer because he's friends with the king, like the British Army. They elected people based on respect, based on how they had known them throughout their lives. These people really didn't move around. So you would have known that guy living in the same town for your entire life. And it really shows how a community unites, comes together, and is willing to fight and die for one another. That is a whole different scene than in 1692 when the whole community is really ripped in half.
So the revolution's first fight occurred in Massachusetts. There's stuff bubbling up in Boston. What is that first sense of something's happening for Danvers and Salem in that area?
So people in the Danvers and Salem area would have heard about many acts passed by Parliament that were really taking away their rights. Many of these people involved in the revolution, at least those who were slightly older, not the very youngest, had fought in the French and Indian War. They had fought for the king. They had fought for the British Empire. But when they get back home, they think they're being mistreated by this government they just spent years and years fighting for. In Salem and Danvers, it really starts to heat up in 1774. What happens is in December of 1773, there's the Boston Tea Party. And after that, once it takes a couple months for word to reach Britain about it, the royal government is absolutely enraged and furious at this destruction of property, this attack on the East India Company, who were really well tied in with the royal family, of course. And what happens is we have a series of coercive acts specifically against Massachusetts that will really alienate more and more people who had not already been alienated by taxes. And in particular, they close the Port of Boston. They change the Massachusetts charter, just like they did in 1691, but nobody heard about it till 1692 in Massachusetts by the time it showed up. So we have a parallel there. And the capital of Massachusetts is moved to Salem. The legislature, the general court, meets in the townhouse in downtown Salem, which is not the same building the witch trials took place in. It's the sequel of the building, but it's like right next door. It's the same spot, right on Washington Street in downtown Salem. And what we have here is British soldiers camped on the common in Salem. General Gage is made governor. Is really like a military governor of Massachusetts. He lives in Danvers that summer, bringing soldiers there. And when he's in Danvers, he's right down the road from the Rebecca Nurse homestead. That you have these British soldiers camped out like almost across the street. It's that close where the soldiers set up their encampment. And that summer, you're going to have real local issues that basically all of these things people have been reading about are now in their backyard. We have the legislature meets in Salem that summer, and they want to choose delegates for a Continental Congress, well, the royal governor doesn't like this. I mean, of course, and he's going to try to stop this. And what ends up happening is General Gage had sent British troops to downtown Salem the day that the legislature is meeting. This is June 17th of 74, exactly a year before the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so they're in the townhouse and they're meeting, and they decide to lock all the doors and kick the public out. And somebody there goes to General Gage and says, they're up to something. Why did they kick everybody out and lock all the doors? So that's when he sends soldiers. He sends the secretary of the province, like the secretary of state, basically, but it's not a state. And he has a proclamation dissolving the legislature, but they can't get in. And so the secretary of state reads it on the street outside. The House of Representatives inside, they never heard it. So they can keep going about their business. They can claim they didn't know that they had been shut down, and they pick people for the Continental Congress in downtown Salem, are 4 representatives from Massachusetts. And that really sets off a couple other events that summer of people trying to defy General Gage. Salem hosts a town meeting, which seems totally normal. It's your local government that had been around since the 1600s. All the voters gather. But General Gage had effectively banned town meeting, local government, other than your once a year set your town budget meeting, because they were using these meetings to spread ideas that he didn't like. He arrests the Salem Committee of Correspondence. Their soldiers are in downtown Salem, and then 3,000 protesters, I guess is the word, show up. And Gage backs down and releases the people he had arrested. And so a week later, the end of our local pressure, a few days later, Danvers had watched this in the town next door, and they decide we should have our own town meeting, see if General Gage shows up. And so they do, and they meet. They don't really have a lot to really say. It's really just like a dare. And then they just extend it, and they're hanging out for like a few hours, just waiting to see what the reaction will be. And someone does tell General Gage, but he decides he doesn't have enough soldiers. He yells out at the messenger, "Damn them, I won't do anything about it unless His Majesty sends me more troops." And the next day he returns to Boston because he was afraid similar things would start happening in Boston.
That's so fascinating about that happening right there in Salem and Danvers in 1774. It's one of those chapters that high school where you learn about the Boston Tea Party and the massacre and all those big events, but what's happening in Danvers and Salem is so important. And you also have in February 1775, something big goes down in Salem with Leslie's retreat.
Locally, it's sort of our next step is Colonel Leslie and his soldiers had actually been some of those camped in Danvers and the Salem Common that summer, but they went back to Boston with Gage in the end of the summer. And so a few months go by, and Gage and the royal government start doing powder raids, which where they realize these local militias had a bunch of guns and they had a bunch of gunpowder, and this was making General Gage uneasy. So in several towns, he would send out soldiers to try to seize them. The last time he tries that is Lexington and Concord. But he had done this up in what's now Somerville. With the Salem, the gunpowder raid, in particular, there were a couple cannons there, small like field pieces. He sends Colonel Leslie by boat to Marblehead, gets off, marches into downtown Salem, getting back to the local Puritan heritage that was still there in the 1770s. General Gage picks Sunday morning because they're all in the meeting house and church, and they can't raise the militia easily. That was a intentional, pretty effective tactic because the British soldiers get all the way through Marblehead, all the way into downtown Salem before anybody notices. So it is a surprise in that sense, pretty much, at least effectively a surprise. And they want to cross the bridge to North Salem, which would be like as if you were heading into Danvers out of downtown Salem. And they raise the bridge. And they just don't let the British soldiers cross. They get into a somewhat comical technical argument that Colonel Leslie says this is the King's Highway. You can't stop a British soldier. The local people say, actually, it's a private bridge. it's a toll bridge that we built with our own money. So yes, we can deny you access and things you didn't think anybody would actually care about or be involved in a serious confrontation. And what happens is that just buys time so that men from Marblehead, Salem, Danvers, and Beverly can turn out with their guns and they come to a negotiated settlement where they let Leslie cross the bridge, walks about 100 paces, looks around, doesn't see any cannons, goes home. And he can tell the governor, I looked, didn't see him. And they avoid actual fighting. There's one person who gets stabbed because General Gage has his soldiers try to seize the boats to cross the river as people in the boats are breaking them up with hatchets so they can't be used. And somebody does get stabbed. They don't die. So it's not that there's zero bloodshed, but effectively.
I wasn't familiar with the stabbing aspect of it. That just is so fascinating that there actually was some bloodshed a couple months prior to Lexington and Concord. So that's interesting to me as well.
Yeah. I think it's such a great opportunity to look back and see that I don't want to use the word expression or really resistance, but it was this comfortable, healthy, like to them, that's what we do. We want to protect our rights or our land, our community. It means something to us. We want it a certain way. We're going to do something about it. I find that part fascinating at that point. Obviously, there's literature and pamphlets and there's responses to resistance. But when it came in that moment, this little community just was like, well, our bridge is going up. It's our bridge. I think that's amazing. The other thing I was going to ask, would have the homestead been the reddish tone it is? Because I was thinking about all that red camped out in the field.
Oh, whether it matches the house. While it would have been originally, I'm unsure if at that moment it would have been. We know that by the end of the late 1800s, it had changed. And red was just so commonly used just because it was cheap. It was just the red, like the iron oxide in the ground, that I'm not sure. My guess would be that definitely would have continued into the 1700s. But by the 1770s, you do have sort of fashion change. You have houses that are redone in the Georgian style that have some white paint. We have others that are like tan. We've kind of moved away from red as the cheap color in the 1690s and black, like the witch house, was the fancy color. There's a lot more options than we have some that are green. So I'm not sure. I would assume it continued.
Well, at any rate, I think it's really cool to see the community coming together. And I do know that there were loyalists. Not everybody resisted, but here you are within those generations really seeing a lot of unity.
Yeah, here locally, pretty much everybody in town is a farmer or a small workshop manufacturer type business. The people who stayed loyal to the crown were really those who were well off, who had ties to the government, that kind of makes sense, or ties to shipping. We do have a Putnam, James Putnam, who had been the last royal attorney general for Massachusetts. He stays loyal. He decides it's in his best interest to leave town after Patriots Day, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and he goes up to Nova Scotia with other, they call them the Loyalist refugees that leave and go up to maritime Canada. So they do definitely exist, but it's very much a minority in communities like this.
How did the men from Danvers and Salem areas, how did they respond to the Lexington alarm?
That is an excellent question. And really one of the core ways that they are involved in the American Revolution is day one. We have the Danvers militia has many companies. On the day of Lexington and Concord, there's going to be more than 300 men under arms who answer the call. And what happens is, to take us back to the Rebecca Nurse homestead, we have Rebecca Nurse's great-grandson, Francis Nurse, is a sergeant in one of the companies. His captain is John Putnam. There's another sergeant who's a Tarbell, which would be one of his cousins, another name from the witch trials. And at about 9 a.m. on April 19th, 1775, they would have heard the bells of the Danvers Meeting House tolling, which would have been not typical And they all gather on the village training field from the north part of Danvers, what's now the town of Danvers. They gather up. They march south to what's today the city of Peabody, that was the southern half of Danvers. They meet up right near Peabody Square. The tree is still there where they all gathered up underneath the different companies before they set off to intercept the British. That tree does exist. It's a giant old tree on the corner. And what they do is they are going to hurry. They run a lot of it, 16 miles to cut off the British. And at this point, they've heard the British have marched on Lexington. They know there's some Patriot leaders there, sure, but it really is another move to seize arms and powder, just like they tried at Salem. And what lesson had been learned by the British that is kind of what leads to the actual war breaking out that day was they felt like they lost Leslie's retreat in Salem, that they were overpowered by the militia, that, they look kind of foolish. They were sent packing back to Boston. And when they do this again, there is this determination of that's not going to happen again, which will lead to it being a much more confrontational situation. So when they opened fire in Lexington and then Concord, the word spread really quickly throughout Massachusetts with the Danvers men and a couple from Beverly that they just live closer to downtown Danvers. They know they can't make it to Lexington in time. It's too far. But they try to cut them off on their way back to Boston. So they meet up at the Jason Russell House in Menotomy, which is today the town of Arlington. Jason Russell is actually the ancestor of Kurt Russell, the famous actor. He had a big visit to this historic site sometime around the 250th last year of Patriots Day. And with this event mostly at Russell's house, but that little downtown neighborhood is really, really brutal. Danvers loses the most men on that day, second only to Lexington. The fighting is savage, it's brutal, and the reason for that is when the British are retreating from Lexington, they are constantly being shot at behind all these trees, all these rock walls, what you think of in those paintings, what you learn about in school about it. And the British, by the time they get to Arlington, a column of reinforcements has met up with them. So they're stronger. They have twice as many soldiers. And they are really, really, really PO'd at how their morning has gone. They are enraged at what has happened to them. And they take it out on Menotomy. The Danvers militia, the local militia, there's other towns that made it there too, take up positions waiting for the British to approach them. Basically like standing their ground as the British are marching on them, not hiding behind a bunch of walls and running away. So it really is a confrontation. And what happens is the British will kill pretty much anybody. If a gunshot comes out of a house, they'll kill everybody in that house. At the Russell house in particular, Russell was 58. Jason Russell, he could barely walk, but he was not very well, but he said he was going to stay. The entire British column had to march right past his front door. So people were telling him not to stay because that was a bad setup. What happens is the Danvers men dug in at his house, and in total, 11 Americans are killed in his house. They're fighting outside. They're fighting in the doorway. He's killed in his doorway, Russell. They are fighting in the living room, the cellar, the attic, just room by room with bayonets, with swords. And to show you how enraged the British were, Russell's body is destroyed. Every soldier that passed his doorway stabbed him on their way by just because they were mad. And it really is a very savage day. There's people who are just in downtown Menotomy. There's a story of people not involved in any sort of fighting that were just captured by the British and robbed. The British execute prisoners of war. They plunder, they steal, they loot the houses on their way by. There's a story of two guys who are just at a bar, the Cooper Tavern in Menotomy, and they decided not to leave, which probably should have. And they end up mangled by the British soldiers. They're just sitting there having a beer. They weren't involved in the battle. They didn't have anything to do with the Danvers militiamen. In total, I should say, there's about 49 Massachusetts people who are killed, and 68 British soldiers at Menotomy. And we see people from Danvers, again, all of these people with seemingly ties to the witch hunt. We have Danvers is one of the few towns that brings back their people who were killed, and they weren't just buried there. Then we have, again, Putnams. We have cousins of the Nurse family who fight and die at this event right before the British do make it back to Boston.
There's a cemetery on the Nurse homestead. How did Putnams and Nurses end up buried together?
I think that's something that a lot of visitors to the Rebecca Nurse homestead ask about or are puzzled about. And it does get us back to a Revolutionary War connection, in that one of the last nurses to be buried there is Sergeant Francis Nurse, who dies in 1780. He answered the call the first day of the Revolution. And one of the other people buried there is an officer who's a Putnam from Danvers who fought in the Revolution. And our link between the two is that Sergeant Francis Nurse marries someone named Eunice Putnam. And therefore, the two families merge. And when their descendants continue on, Sergeant Francis, his son, will sell it basically to his cousins, the Putnams, and that they will take over ownership of the Nurse homestead. And so Sergeant Francis is buried where Matthew Putnam is, almost like two ends of the same sort of row. There's a different section for the Putnams. And it was Matthew's father who purchased it from his cousin, the farm. So he's the first to really live the rest of his life there after the Revolution. And I think that really shows how groups are coming together. They've clearly put bygones be bygones. Fortunately, those Putnams were also descendants of Nathaniel Putnam, who had defended Rebecca Nurse at that point in time. And so that cemetery for generations continued to have both families buried there, that their agreement was the Nurse family could keep burying people there. The Putnams could now bury people there. And so that goes on for a while. The last burial is in the Putnam section, and it's sometime in the 1920s.
So who was Israel Putnam? I know he was a big figure in the Revolution, wasn't he? But he had a Danvers connection.
Absolutely. So Israel Putnam is born in 1718 in Salem Village. His father, Joseph Putnam, was the half-brother of Thomas Putnam, one of the main accusers in the witch hunt. Now, the difference is that Joseph Putnam was not on the side of the accusers in the witch hunt and really did not believe in the witch hunt, leading to the Putnam family really being split on this issue. And so Israel is Joseph's son. His father was an opponent of the witch hunt, not involved in those accusations, but yet his whole extended family pretty much had been involved in accusing people. So he's baptized at the Salem Village Church, Israel Putnam is. By this time, we no longer have Reverend Paris. It's Joseph Green, the minister who had come to Salem Village to kind of put the community back together, so to speak, afterwards. And he lives in Salem Village for a while. His only education was at the little congregational school run by the minister. And Israel Putnam does not write very well. His formal education is definitely limited. He is a very bright person, but in terms of his school learning, very limited. He plays an incredibly significant role in the American Revolution. He is one of the oldest Revolutionary War generals, so he does not live all the way to the free and independent United States of America. He ends up having a stroke in later years. So he's not involved in the army throughout the war. He's not involved once it really becomes our own republic. He is not as famous as one might expect. And I think part of it is we don't have a lot of his personal writings. He's not John Adams. He's not John Hancock. He doesn't have all these diaries, all of these things, because of his kind of limited education. When he's a general, he always has his assistant write all his letters for him. And when you do read the couple that he writes himself, like on the fly in the middle of a battle, it's kind of hard to figure out what's being said here. So I think that's why he's not as well remembered, but he should be. He moved to Connecticut after he gets married. He fights in the French and Indian War in upstate New York. Interestingly, posted alongside a lot of militiamen from the Danvers and Salem area who are like his cousins, people he would have grown up with. people who then fight at Menotomy also. When Lexington happens, he's on his farm down in Connecticut. And there's so many legends with Israel Putnam that are, some are plausibly true, like him fighting a wolf, and that's why they call him Old Wolf. Other things are seemingly embellished. He reportedly is out in his field when the messenger comes from Boston, from Watertown, really, is where the revolutionary government sent out riders. Went from Worcester straight down to Connecticut to him. And he's out there literally plowing his field. Now, the story is set up so much like an ancient Roman. It's a true story, but it's one of those that's a legendary story just in the way people retell it, of Cincinnatus, who was this Roman guy in like the 580s BC. And he was retired. He had been a military leader, retired, and then Rome's under attack. And they call him, he literally left his plow in the field, went to Rome. They gave him absolute power as a dictator. He defends Rome, and when it's done, he gives all the power back and goes home again. The idea of like, with great power is great responsibility. And it's funny that people portray Israel Putnam as that, because that's what people portray George Washington also. That's why you have the Order of the Cincinnati, is the Revolutionary War veterans and such. So it's interesting that that myth is actually here, really attached to Putnam. But to make a long story short, he allegedly leaves his plow in the field and immediately rides for Boston, but he got his stuff together first and then came up here. He will lead the Army of Connecticut outside Boston. That after Patriots' Day, all of these Massachusetts militiamen keep pouring in towards Boston. People from out in the more western Massachusetts, people from southern New Hampshire answer the call. And so Boston's surrounded. You have different generals from different colonies that don't really answer to one another because they're separate armies technically, and it's kind of a mess. But he's in charge of the Connecticut soldiers. And with him, his local most important event is going to be the Battle of Bunker Hill. He's also involved at the end of the siege of Boston, and he'll be really important in the Battle of New York the following summer in 76. He, overall, was an interesting figure in the siege of Boston because he had actually known a lot of the British officers in Boston. The British are now nowhere in Massachusetts except bottled up in Boston. And they're surrounded, other than the Royal Navy that can, keep bringing ships in and out. But it's weird that he knows a lot of his adversaries, that he fought with them up in upstate New York against the French Canadians and such. And he's one of the bolder generals or officers in general in what is this provincial army. He is one of the first to say that the colony should take Bunker Hill and fortify it against the British. And at first, the Council of War, that they call the meeting of all the generals whenever they're trying to decide on a battle plan, is not in on that. Not in on that. Too bold, too bold. But then by the time another month passes and they're in June, he suggests it in May, it's not really going to work. Mid-June, they're in on it. And so he not just proposes it, but he is physically there in the battle. That he is the highest ranking officer, like fighting, other than we're going to have General Ward, who actually will die. And he was the president of the Massachusetts provisional government, so the revolutionary government. With Putnam, he allegedly says, don't fire until they see the whites of their eyes. There are people for generations and generations who fight over who said those words. There is articles upon articles. There are angry letters from the early 1800s after angry letters of, no, my ancestor said that. No, our ancestor said that. That is a whole issue for kind of another day. But what it seems to be is that were the common phrase, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, had been said by other military leaders in the previous generation. And that, yeah, Putnam probably said it, but he also probably wasn't the only one who said it. And that kind of tells you why everybody's like, no, this guy said it. No, that guy said it. With Putnam himself, he does frequently return to visit Danvers throughout his life, and he will liberate Boston on evacuation day. When the British withdraw, they are kind of afraid to go into Boston because there had been this horrible smallpox outbreak, and that Putnam was old enough that he had had the smallpox the last time it came around, and so that he was given command of the troops that actually were the first to march into the city. His career does last for years. His other main notoriety is the Battle of New York of Long Island, specifically Brooklyn. Once the war moves out of Massachusetts, New York is really the next focal point. With us and our 250th events around here, we are through most of them at this point, yet the war is only just beginning, it seems. And at Brooklyn, he will command the defense of Long Island when the British land. The British invade. It's the largest amphibious invasion in world history at that point in time. The British land 20,000 soldiers on Long Island. Putnam had a different job. He was in charge of Manhattan. And then General Greene, in charge of Long Island, got sick and got replaced. And then his replacement needed to be replaced. So Putnam's put in charge like a day before this enormous battle. And it doesn't go great, but you're severely outnumbered. They have a fleet, and it was someone else's battle plan. And so he'll continue fighting around New York and Connecticut for like most of the rest of the war.
Great. Did he have sons fighting?
He did. He had a son who came up with him around Boston. He had a couple sons who, in several capacities. One of them is really his aide-de-camp, Daniel, for a while. He has another son with him when he's in upstate New York. That they were involved. And throughout the way, he also keeps bumping into his Massachusetts cousins. He has a cousin, Rufus Putnam, who's involved in basically like a military engineer of the fortifications around Boston, what they were going to dig on Bunker Hill, how they built the fortifications on Dorchester Heights, that then they put cannons there and the British had to leave because they realized that they could shoot into Boston. His cousin, he also had been in upstate New York during the French and Indian War. That it's funny how these people keep crossing paths with people that they knew from around here, basically wherever they end up on campaign.
Israel Putnam, did he know General Gage in the French and Indian War?
I don't believe that they had crossed paths, that Gage had been further south. He had actually crossed paths with Washington in the French and Indian War down in Virginia, but he had crossed paths with people like General Clinton, basically the generals directly below Gage.
Do you know much about Colonel Israel Hutchinson?
Yeah, he had been a captain in the Danvers militia. He goes on to be a colonel. He was with Putnam in upstate New York. He answers the call on Patriots Day, and then his group goes on to later Saratoga in upstate New York.
Yeah, he happens to be my first cousin.
Oh.
That's why I asked. Because my two Hutchinson ancestors in Danvers at the time were Josiah and Josiah. And one, I think, was just a little too old to fight, and one was a little too young. So I kind of look at what were my cousins up to at that fight? And he was definitely involved in Menotomy.
And with Joseph Hutchinson, the site of where his house has a large monument. And the reason for that is after Menotomy, the remains of the 7 Danvers soldiers who were killed were brought back to his house first. And that's where they were laying. And so on Patriots Day, the Danvers Alarmless Company, the Revolutionary War reenactors that own and operate the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, they do their stations in the morning of visiting every known grave of those who had died at Menotomy, as well as they go to Hutchinson's house every Patriots Day.
How is Benjamin Franklin? He's one of our favorite founding father. Every child knows about him in America. How was he connected to both the Revolution and the Salem witch trials?
Yes. So Benjamin Franklin is like Israel Putnam in the sense that they're only one generation removed. Both of them were among the older people in the 1770s involved in the Revolution. But their parents, or in Benjamin Franklin's case, his aunt, played important roles in the witch hunt in Salem Village. Benjamin Franklin's aunt was Bathsheba Pope, who was an accuser in 1692. she becomes one of the afflicted accusers, and she's one of the first two adults to claim to be afflicted. It's her and Mrs. Putnam are the first two adults. Two moments of her time in the witch hunt that stick out to me are on March 13th, 1692, as we've only had a handful of accusations yet at that point. She interrupts a service in the meeting house, claiming that she had been struck blind. Interrupts the minister, stands up, claims that through some witchcraft, through some magic, that she's struck blind. And then again, only about 11 days later, on March 24th, she has a giant fit claimed to be caused by witchcraft on the day Rebecca Nurse is arrested and brought before the two judges. And when she stands up, as the judges are sort of easing up on their questions to Rebecca Nurse, she stands up, has this giant fit, flailing and screaming, and then all the other accusers break out also. That she starts that whole round in that moment. And with Benjamin Franklin, of course, someone familiar to all of your listeners, I think, he's interesting in the start of the Revolution in that he is in London in 74 when all these laws against Massachusetts are being passed, although he's from Boston originally, since his family was around here. Of course, he's much more associated with Philadelphia, where he had gone on to live. He's in London at the start because he's the agent for some of the North American colonies. The colonies weren't represented in the House of Commons, the whole no taxation without representation thing. But they also couldn't send an ambassador to London because they're the same country. So the colonies would hire agents that were like basically their lobbyist to go meet with members of parliament and say the Massachusetts government would actually prefer this instead of that. So he's lobbyist, and he's there on behalf of multiple colonies, but Massachusetts for a while, primarily Pennsylvania, sometimes both, representing their interests as it breaks out. He then, of course, returns home, and I think the rest of the story is pretty known there. But he has an interesting perspective in that he's overseas for some of these beginning events.
You've mentioned the Danvers Alarmless Company and the Homestead. Tell us about the Homestead and the company.
Yeah, so the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, although predominantly, of course, a museum about the witch hunt of 1692, is owned and operated by a nonprofit group of Revolutionary War reenactors because of Rebecca Nurse's great-grandson, Sergeant Francis Nurse, who fought at Menotomy. And they have been incredibly busy for the 250th of the American Revolution. They started for the bicentennial, so this is sort of round two for some of them. And of course, there are many younger recruits also, who this is round one for. And the event locally, so many of them for the 250th have been organized by the Danvers Alarmists. Not just things in Danvers, but in Salem. The anniversary of Leslie's retreat was for a large part organized by them. The actual reenactment was organized by them. They've been in surrounding communities on various events, and they'll continue to follow the war, going out with the goal being to go to the reenactments of anywhere that people from their original unit in the 1770s actually had fought, where the men from Danvers had actually fought. With the homestead itself, there is some reinterpretation or reorganization for the 250th that, although not yet completed, there's a part of the house, one of the bedrooms, that's going to be set up as it would have been in 1775 when Francis Nurse left the house to answer the alarm. The house was built in so many different time periods that part of the house was more about the 1750s, we think. And so that's the part of the house that most fits with his era. And so sort of realigning and reinterpreting that helps reach that other generation of history.
Are there tours available?
Yeah, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead is open weekends in the spring, rainy days in the summer, and about half a week in the busy fall season. Additionally, I do walking tours in Danvers of some of the witch trials sites in the historic district in Danvers. We start at the training field where the militia left for Menotomy. Not that that's our theme of the tour, but it's true. We see the foundation of Reverend Samuel Parris's house, what's left of the building that was the tavern in Salem Village, the memorial to the victims of the witch hunts, the first church of Danvers that was the same congregation that was in Salem Village in 1692. So that's our loop. We've been doing that. Let's see. I started doing that in 2021, which was when the book came out. And so this will be our 5th season, which that went quick. But yeah, still going.
Awesome.
Yeah, we really appreciate your research.
Oh, thank you.
Definitely.
Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate your program, the podcast. It's a great way to have people related not just to Salem, but to other witch hunts who have different expertise, different perspectives and categories than I had encountered other places.
I'm sure you, our listeners, enjoyed getting to know more about the American Revolution and the Salem history as much as we did. Thanks, Dan.
We hope you share this episode with someone who loves American history.
Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and learn more about our work at endwitchhunts.org, and consider picking up Dan's book if you haven't from our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.